cloud. Okay, welcome everyone. I am Enrica from Plant Powered Metro New York. I'm the Queen's organizer. And Plant Powered Metro New York is a community-based organization committed to our collective health empowerment through whole food, plant-based nutrition, which is an evidence-based approach to nutrition that can prevent, treat, and even reverse chronic disease. While we normally prefer to offer live sessions to build community around health and nutrition, we are offering this program as part of a web series during the season of COVID-19. So welcome. Today we have Nivi Jaswal. Nivi has an MBA in behavioral marketing and is a board certified health and wellness coach trained at the Mayo Clinic, and is also a certified lifestyle medicine coach by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. We have Dr. Evan Queler. Dr. Evan Queler is a board certified lifestyle medicine physician and board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation. So welcome. So let's start with Nivi.
Sorry.
Nivi?
Yes, I'm right here. So
Nivi, you are started out in business, typical businesswoman, living the fast pace. So you went from business to health, but before you did that, you have an amazing story, a beautiful story about healing. So I'm excited. Please tell us a little about yourself and your story of healing.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Enrica, for that beautiful introduction. And so let me actually share with you guys how I, stumbled upon the plant-based world and the world of, fasting and understanding how fasting works for me personally. So I have a 15-year-old career in processed foods and beverages, and then medical devices, and the time I was with processed food and beverages, it was more the healthcare innovation portfolio that I was handling for multinational company, and lived in around 6 to 7 different parts of the world. Very exciting. I'm a big foodie. I love food. And the one thing that lends itself to a very ketogenic mindset, ketogenic lifestyle, ketogenic attitude towards life overall, is the processed foods and beverages industry. And I was mired deep into it. I was practicing, ketogenic diet, and I believed in it. And I would go to the gym and I would drink bullet coffee because I was told that it would improve my stamina and, during workouts and stuff like that. So, and for those of you who don't know what a bullet coffee is, it's coffee and coconut oil mixed into it for good measure. And I would do all of those things. And then, 2015, about 5 years ago, I was 35 then. And I started noticing that my weight would go up and down. And I was never really, obese. I didn't deal with obesity, but I had a high body fat percentage. And my body fat percentage was up to 37% at its peak. And just to put things in perspective, I'm 5 feet and 0 inches tall. I'm a small person. I'm a really short person. And with 37% body fat, that was just, a lot. And that wouldn't budge. My body weight would budge, but my body fat percentage wouldn't really budge. In March of 2015, I was in Hong Kong, and 5 espressos, hardly any food, and 1 day-long workshop later, which I was leading, I declined an offer to go for dinner with my team. Instead, I went back to the hotel room. And 30 minutes later, after entering the hotel room, I found myself on the floor. And I sort of like looked for signs of if somebody had come into the room and whether I was hurt or anything. Nothing. It was no one. The door was locked from the inside. I must have fainted. Something must have happened. And I had lots and lots of missed calls, completely unlike me. I'm constantly online, and, you know, I didn't sleep too well a lot of the years. So I was even sending out emails at 3 o'clock in the morning. So a lot of people, including family and friends, they were worried. Nivi fell off the radar for a whole 30 minutes. And you know, she's in Hong Kong. And I was based in Singapore at the time. I got on a flight back home the following morning, and I reached back and I admitted myself, you know, to the hospital. I went there, and I was working for a medical device company at the time. So I went to one of our clients, a cardiologist, and I told him, I think I might have had a problem with my heart. I think, you know, I had a cardiac event or something. Please hook up all whatever you need to do, and, you know, just hook me up to any, you know, leads, and to figure out if my heart's sound. And they ran all checks. My heart was, you know, structurally perfectly fine. But that day, I went from being a person who was working in the healthcare industry, was seemingly healthy, was practicing this really healthy ketogenic lifestyle, was going to the gym. I went from being that person to a person who walked out with a verdict of a long list of illnesses. They declared me pre-diabetic. I had signs of PCOS. You know, moving rapidly towards infertility, had extreme tachycardia after every meal, and my heart rate would go as high as 146 to 166 beats per minute. And that was really, really, really dangerous. And I knew that I was missing something. I was looking for some answers. And I stumbled upon the China study by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. And reading that book completely changed my life. And I watched Forks Over Knives, and, you know, the rest is history for those amongst, you know, in the audience who are plant-based. You know that there are these documentaries out there, and then there are, you know, lots and lots of books that you can read. And eventually I ended up training at the Mayo Clinic, and got board certified in health and wellness coaching, and you know, learned more and more, and help a lot of people who want to try this lifestyle out for health. So that's my story, and pertinent to the topic that we're going to talk about, which is fasting. And Rika, I know that I've heard you mention this before, that, you know, you're fascinated with this idea. You don't know really what fasting is.
Exactly.
Yes, like I was right there with you at that point, you know, in 2015, even in 2016, I would get hangry. If I skipped a meal, it would impact my mood. I knew that it was primarily because I skipped the meal. I would tell people, don't talk to me until I've had my 11 o'clock in the morning coffee, you know, after, you know, getting into work, and so on. And I couldn't fast, because that was incomprehensible. It was inconceivable for someone who couldn't even go without, you know, eating a meal. And until I'd had that meal, or if something that I was craving, typically something salty, something really sweet. And once I had that would satisfy me. And I was, you know, back to being human, and I was able to interact with people. And I knew that this pattern wasn't normal, but at the same time, fasting was a distant dream. And the big shift for me that happened was when I went whole foods, plant-based, oil-free, I realized that my cravings subsided. I wasn't craving for that 11 o'clock coffee along with a cookie anymore. I wasn't reaching out for that bag of chips at 4 o'clock, 4:30 p.m. anymore. I was, you know, loaded on fiber, because I was eating a lot of fruits, vegetables, and, you know, legumes, lentils, leafy greens, all of those things. And I'd gone oil-free. So my body fat percentage dropped. I'm right now, as of this morning, I'm a 20.4% body fat, and aged 40. I think that's, you know, pretty awesome. And gradually what happened is that I started to explore fasting or restricted eating. And I started with what's called intermittent fasting. And I know that, Evan, Dr. Queller here will share with us the medical basis of, different types of fasts, different objectives, the fact that, some are best done under clinical supervision, but purely from personal experience, I'm just sharing my journey. I started with the intermittent fasting. What I do is I stop eating at 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m., and on a typical evening, and I would then break my fast when I wake up the following morning around 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. And that has become a routine for me. And I can do that without getting hangry, which was initially a big deal for me. I was surprised at myself that, wow, I'm not feeling that I need to go reach out for different things and so on. What I also started incorporating by myself without any clinical supervision is gentle, safe 24-hour, which is like a day-long fasting. And I, went into it with open eyes, and I said, all right, okay, I'm going to do water only. Maybe I'll grab a green tea or something. But if I feel that I'm about to faint or feel hypoglycemic or anything like that, I'm going to eat something. I'm going to have a banana, or I'm going to have a piece of fruit handy. Because you don't want to be caught with hypoglycemia. So I gave that a go. What I do is, once a month or twice a month, I would just say, all right, it's a Monday or it's a Tuesday, and I'm just going to fast today. The thing that I really wanted to share with you about, no matter what type of fasting you do, gentle, safe, intermittent, or just a day long, or I know Nina here, shared with us that she's done water only 72 hours fasting, and she did it under supervision of a professional. So no matter where you're at on your fasting exploration journey, or if you've never done it and you're just fasting curious, the big thing for me was to understand that as a species, as human beings, we don't come from abundance. We come from a situation of scarcity. And we've thrived under situations of scarcity. Whenever there's a constraint, whenever there's a challenge, whenever there's scarcity, human beings thrive. So why shouldn't that be true? Hey, Wendy, why shouldn't that be true for our bodies as well? And it turns out that when we're consuming energy, our bodies are busy. And when we don't consume energy, and when we stop giving food to our body gets busy, even busier, doing some other things and taking care of some other things on our behalf. So the big learning for me was to align with the rhythm of having and not having, having and not having. And in not having is where you learn so much. You not only end up resetting your taste buds, you also end up realigning yourself, realigning your priorities. So one of the big things, and I'm going to stop talking after that, is one of the big things for me was when I did, recently I did a 60-hour water only fast. It was clinically supervised. And when I did that, I realized I couldn't get on social media because there's so much about food on my social media, where somebody's cooking something with cookies and somebody's baking, and baking's a big deal now that everyone's under, lockdown situation. And I just didn't want anything to do with food thoughts, or food triggers, food prep, because I was in a fast. And that gave me a sense of time deceleration. It felt like time stopped. And I paused and I reflected during the 60-hour fast, and I started thinking to myself that, oh my God, there's so much of my life, of my daily routine that has become about food and thinking about food and looking at food, that time flies. And now that I've taken that away, I don't know what I'm going to do with the time that I've unlocked for myself. And what I ended up doing was I started an art project, and I read a book that I wouldn't have read otherwise. And I freed some time, extra time out for meditation. I looked up a new app. I actually found a tremendous app for meditation. And I started doing it. I'm hooked to that app now. And those were the insights. And every fast is different. Every fasting experience is different. And whenever I welcome the fasting experience in my life, what I'm also welcoming are new insights. And so that's basically been my experience and my journey and my background, Enrica.
So thanks, Nivi. So there's different levels of fasting. I am totally new to fasting. My idea of fasting right now, especially with this pandemic, is just not to eat right until the moment I go to bed. My 90-year-old aunt tells me, don't eat after a certain hour. Stop at least by 7 or 8 o'clock, and then don't eat until the next morning. So I'm totally green to fasting. So Dr. Queller, please tell all of us a little about fasting and share with us, please.
Sure. I was more so showing up here to see if there was any questions that I could help answer for anybody. I mean, fasting is a dietary intervention, but it's also sometimes imposed upon us as a human species where it's famine, right? I think that the term fasting is not so much for the treatment of disease, but rather the prevention of disease, or the treatment to stay well or to stay healthy. The idea is that we're putting a lot of food substances in our bodies that are fanning the flames of chronic disease. And when the body has a chance and given the right milieu, the body has an innate ability to heal itself. Different types of fasting. I mean, there's the term intermittent fasting as a generalized term of essentially is more so decreased meal frequency, whereby there's a restriction of the feeding period during the day. So it's also known as time-restricted feeding as opposed to intermittent fasting. I could get into a little bit of like what some intermittent fasts are that you probably have heard of, but time-restricted feeding is a shift in the perspective of just looking at the time period you can eat rather than the time period you're not. So it's similar, but it's not the same as caloric restriction. Your body goes into a fasting state after 24 to 30 hours. You start shifting your metabolism. You start, what is in your intestines is now typically has exited out and has gone through the digestive process. There's always a second meal effect, so food can stay in the system for quite some time. But after about 30 hours, your body starts to recognize that there isn't a steady glucose supply. You're tapping into glycogen storage, which is glucose in your muscles and your liver. Your brain and your red blood cells need those to survive, thrive off of glucose. And then there's a secondary metabolism, a shift in metabolism when you're in a fasting state, where after about 30 hours, you start shifting into ketosis. And your body also is tapping into your muscles and breaking down muscle tissue to produce glucose. And so there's this mixture of ketones and glucose in the body. And during the second or third day, you've now depleted your glycogen stores by more than 50%. And you're going to be tapping into ketosis primarily, and you're also shifting some other metabolic pathways that occur during fasting, such as cellular cleanup or this autophagy, self-eating. And then also around day 3 or day 4, you start actually producing myelogenous stem cells. So when people are talking about, fasting during the day, it's more so time-restricted feeding. And when looking at these longevity hotspots around the world where people live, there's a higher concentration of centenarians where they're living a long life, but they're also thriving and functioning quite well. There's usually a dietary pattern of, eating for 12 hours and fasting for 12 hours, and usually, not skipping out on breakfast and having a lighter meal in the evening. And what seems to be helpful is, to not eat after 7 p.m., as a general rule, and to minimize skipping out on breakfast. And this time restricted feeding and intermittent fasting that people are doing are oftentimes, would optimize it even more by not skipping out on the breakfast, and more so front loading the calories. But back to just, talking about the different types of fasting. So there's that intermittent fasting that's really time restricted feeding and is not really technically fasting. But then there's intermittent fasting like 16-8 that refers to fasting for 16 hours and only eating during 8-hour windows. And again, that's time restricted feeding. But then there's like a 5-2 diet where you have 500 calories for 2 days of the week, and that's either done consecutively or non-consecutively during that 7-day week. That's a type of intermittent fasting. Like the 1 meal a day is really not intermittent fasting. That's time restricted feeding. 23 hours of fasting and 1 hour of eating during the 2 to 3 period. There's periodic fasting that's not done consistently. It's done intermittently, but it could be done during a varying duration depending on the use of it. Typically, the duration of periodic fasting is like 4 days, but it could be done as short as 36 hours. There's water-only fasting where you're abstaining from any consumption of food except for water, but also done in an environment of complete rest. And that should be done under direct medical supervision where vitals are taken and routine blood work is taken, and electrolytes and liver function and kidney function is being monitored, because complications can occur. And especially even during the refeeding period, it's categorically a safe thing comparatively to some of the invasive things in conventional medicine, but it could sometimes, there are case reports of people having harm, of having cardiac arrhythmias, of falling, of having sudden death due to a refeeding abnormality, due to a refeeding metabolic pathway problem that occurs. So that's essentially what the different types of, the definition of fasting. But fasting is applied depending on the individual, and sometimes a little bit of help could be helpful. Sometimes it's hard for people to make changes, so there are to perhaps adhere to a healthier lifestyle, such as adopting a whole food plant-based diet, and they're used to calorically rich and processed foods and have an affinity towards these foods that just taste hyper palatable. And when you try and eat helpful foods, it doesn't taste good. And so it's not sustainable. So how do you make this healthier lifestyle sustainable? Well, you do a jump start, you have a life-threatening illness that scares the hell out of you, and you'll do it. And sometimes it's partaking in a fast. So a fast could sometimes be used as a tool to help habit formation and get people on the right start. And very similar to the idea of going to detox for drug rehab, and then it's, well, what is the lifestyle that you're adhering to after this fast, after this intervention? And sometimes it's other tools like a 21-day jumpstart, or whatever challenge it might be. And then there are times where a fast is used as a medical intervention and is not something promoted or advocated for by the pharmaceutical industry, because it's not a thing that could be sold. It's the human body healing itself and getting out of the way. And so there are places like the True North Health Clinic where they, in Santa Rosa, California, where they admit people and they monitor them, and people are on medications and they get them off of their medications, and they're being managed accordingly as their body is healing. And it's healing when it's just consuming water, because you can survive off of just water for a long period of time. So those are like, so that's a little bit of my, ad lib, spiel about fasting, but I'd love to answer, any of your questions that maybe you have. I feel like I'd be better able to, be of service by addressing any questions you guys might have.
Evan, while looking into the different types of fasting, I've come across this word autophagy.
Auto is self, phagy is, is eating. So during the fast, think of it like there's like a construction site. It's, if you want to gut the house and renovate it, you'll gut it out. So the fasting process, the body is able to clean up the cellular debris. There's also the triggering of apoptosis, which we oftentimes hear of over the years of being stricken by cancer. And the idea is that this programmed cell death doesn't occur. This apoptosis doesn't occur due to genetic mutation. So like the BRCA gene is supposed to inhibit growth. So you've deleted the inhibitor. You have a double negative. And so then the cell grows. The breast cancer, you have a proclivity to breast cancer. So when you fast, or when you are just taking care of your body, but one of the metabolic processes during fasting is that you're triggering certain cellular mechanisms that take place that repair DNA and genetic mutations, that clean up junk and byproducts of, just like us as human beings, we have junk and byproducts all around planet Earth. Within our cells, where it's machinery, there's things going on, there's a metabolic process going on, there's breakdown of material, right? So the crap you put into you is like the crap that's in your cells. That's why you want to try and eat clean, so then maybe your cells and your body will be a little bit cleaner. It's the whole concept of how are you supposed to be healthy in a polluted world. But autophagy is something that was discovered over the past decade, and that seems to be turned on. This process seems to be turned on after about 3 days of the body feeling like it's in a famine. Right, where you're tapping into these fasting pathways. You're in ketosis. There's decreased caloric intake, and certain metabolic processes are turned on. There's the mTOR pathway, which is turned on by animal products and high concentrations of leucine and lysine, which are amino acids in meat, in animal flesh. That activates mTOR. That turns that on. That is great when you're 20 years old and you're Arnold Schwarzenegger and you want to build muscles. But when you don't want to die of cancer, and you don't want to die of premature aging, and you want to have resilience, you don't want that mTOR pathway. You don't want to be constantly flooring your gas pedal on your car. It will break down. So mTOR is activated with certain lifestyles. There are certain things that turn it on. Anabolic steroids turn it on. Animal products turn it on. Fasting slows it down. It starts to slow down after a few days. You wind that down. PKA pathway is stimulated by sugar. and other different compounds, which is why food is almost like chemistry. It has an interaction with our DNA and these cellular pathways that interact with our genetic material. And these pathways are involved with turning on autophagy and apoptosis and this genetic expression of how our body is functioning and the metabolic pathways that are taking place. So the autophagy is a cellular cleanup. And so you have this opportunity where your body is cleaning the cells out. And then after the fast, it's how are you going to refuel your body? What are the new beautiful pieces of furniture that you're going to lay down to this new home that you've created? You just did a demolition. Now you want to put in new furniture. I've heard of Walter Longo. He's over at the University of Southern California. He gave this analogy of a train that doesn't have any more fuel to get to the next station, right? Because it's fasting. So they're like, let's burn all the old benches. And we don't have any coal, but we'll burn this wood, and we'll burn the old ones. We'll keep the good ones. We'll burn those till we get to the next station. And when we get to the next station, when our fast is over, we could refeed with some broccoli and some kale and some berries and put those back into the train, and we'll have these really sturdy, healthy, pieces of furniture.
All right. Dr. Queller, we do have a few questions. There's one question from Juana Gilmore, and she asks, doesn't the body go into starvation mode at some point, and does the stomach begin to shrink?
Yeah, I mean, there are, the body, so the first question was, when does the body go into starvation mode?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, after about 24, 48 hours, you start, you're depleting your glycogen stores and start then tapping your body. Your body's like, well, we need to save this brain, and we need to save these red blood cells. They require glucose. All right, let's break down amino acids. Muscle. We don't need this muscle. We don't need, so we'll break down the muscle. We'll start to break down some fat and convert that into glucose. And now we have our glucose. And eventually your body's like, whoa, you're losing too much muscle. And there's no more glycogen in your liver and your muscles either. And we're going to break down more muscle. You're going to get scrawny, but we're also going to start tapping into that storage depot of caloric excess of being an American in a westernized world. We're going to burn up some of that fat storage and start using that for ketones. And that 24, 36 hours happens. I'm sure there's a right answer for the board exam. And then the second part of the question was, you go into this, that's the kind of like this process of going into like this famine state. And then what was the second part of the question?
So Juana, do you want to unmute yourself and explain?
Okay. Am I muted?
No, you're fine now. We can hear you.
Okay. No, I understand that the stomach begins to, at least I've had that experience myself, because I used to fast quite a bit in the past. Mm-hmm. And when I would return to eating, and I understood that you have to start with broths and things that are light, nothing processed certainly, and I don't eat processed food at all. But then I found that I would consume very little, mm-hmm. and I would be full. And it was explained to me that the stomach actually shrinks during the process of fasting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, there's a couple of layers to that, there's a lot of, myth and lore out there, and it's good to just, generally speaking, as a broad stroke, to say, yes, it's nice to kind of have like some type of transition, of breaking the fast, certainly. And there's lots of different things that, well, not lots, there's several mechanisms that take place that provide satiety and make us feel satisfied, right? And give us that sense of fullness. And one of them are mechanical stretch receptors in our stomach that create a feedback mechanism that says, oh, this is being stretched, you know. So there is some, you know, communication with the viscera, you know, our tissue in our abdomen that tells us that we're feeling full. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, fiber and bulk is so helpful. You know, it's one of the things that it's just like the whole system just works well, you know, for us. You know, it feeds the microbiome, but it also creates a sense of satiety and fullness and satisfaction. You know, and, you know, one of the things that undermine our efforts of sometimes losing weight is oil. You know, oil is one way to seamlessly undermine one's efforts in trying to decrease their caloric intake. You know, it's like, how do you diet without dieting? How do you diet without restricting yourself, right? Because a fast is not sustainable, right? That's what dieting is, right? Like, is starving yourself. But like, if you are on a sustainable lifestyle where you're not feeling hungry all the time and you're feeling satisfied, then you feel like you could do it all the time. And so eating foods that are high in fiber are also good for you. And those are plant-based foods. But yeah, your stomach shrinks, and that's what they're trying to do surgically too, with gastric sleeves. And what you're experiencing is real. But there's also, when you're fasting, your reward center changes. You know, you could have a physical, like, you know, sensation mechanically, but then there's also that, like, that emotional feeling of satiety, right? Like, you know, and that is part of, like, tapped into our pleasure, you know, is that sense of satisfaction. And people don't feel satisfied sometimes with healthy foods because they need that fix. And they're like, well, and that's where sometimes, you know, what someone is saying their body needs versus actual maybe withdrawal symptoms are different.
Right.
Thanks for your question.
Which is the most effective form of fasting of the types that you mentioned already? That's another question.
Well, I think that I think that it depends, and I think that there's a lot of research out there. Like, I think that, you know, I don't know if there's necessarily one fasting that's more effective than the other. I think it's not that it's a wrong question, but it's just like sometimes what are you really trying to know? But it's the wrong question in the sense that it's not going to get you to the right answer of what your ultimate goal is. So it's a fair question. I think that there are different, you know, it just depends. Like, what is the one that you're going to be compliant with? What's the one that's going to be safe? What's the one that's not going to necessarily compromise or mortgage your health? I think it's sometimes people aren't necessarily fasting, but they're pointing their health trajectory in the right direction. You know, you're not perhaps going to tap into some of the metabolic processes. If you're consuming maple syrup, you're going to be preventing your body from tapping into, let's say, ketosis. But you don't necessarily need to have ketosis to necessarily reap the benefits, or sometimes trigger some of these metabolic pathways that are part of cellular regeneration and rejuvenation and stem cell production either, or tapping into your visceral abdominal fat. So I think, like, there is some research that comes to mind where they compared a fasting mimicking diet for people with an inflammatory bowel disease with a water only fast versus, you know, versus a product put out by a company called L-Nutra that mimics a fasting state. So your stomach is seeing food, while tricking these nutrient sensing pathways into thinking your body's in a fasting state. So what they found was that when they gave there's a mouse model, a irritant, there was within the intestinal lining for the water-only fasters, there was bleeding. There was an inflammatory process due to their inflammatory bowel disease. But with the food that was being provided in the fasting mimicking diet, where their body was being tricked into a fasting state, their intestinal lining did not develop any colitis or any bleeding, because there was like a microfilm layer from the microbiome protecting the gut lining. Perhaps some people might need a more aggressive fasting state of water-only fasting for certain conditions, and might benefit from that. Perhaps a fasting mimicking diet, like something like over on the market, like Prolon, like isn't what someone needs enough. They need more medical supervision and a more sustained fast, and it's done under water-only fasting, and that could help promote the healing that isn't taking place by adhering to a nutrient-dense, whole food, plant-based diet, where, but I don't know if necessarily one fast is necessarily better than the other. I think that it's a matter of like, what one is trying to accomplish, and what their goals are, and whether or not they could be compliant with it. It's almost like, what's the healthiest bean? It's like the one you eat the most. What's that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good way of putting it. What's the healthiest bean? The one that you eat the most. So if you do have ambition of going on a prolonged fast, but you neither have clinical supervision available, nor, are you clear about what that would benefit you, from, and also you're not going to be compliant, then it's as good as not doing it.
Yeah, and
okay.
I think for the most part, and I think that it's still not a blanket statement for everybody, but for the most part, most people, unless they're like perhaps maybe injecting insulin or on blood sugar medications, or they're really very sick, but for the most part, people could quite safely for 1 to 2 days sip on a veggie broth, be getting some electrolytes, getting their potassium, not getting lightheaded and passing out because they're getting some electrolytes to maintain their fluid status, consuming that with some water and some herbal teas. That is, a nice reset to do and can be done in a safe way. It's just sometimes people are on medications or they have certain medical conditions where there might be other things to consider on an individualized basis. But for the most part, we're in an environment of dietary excess, and then just in the spirit of balance, it's like if we're always eating all the time, well, it's also okay for us not to eat all the time. But doing that for an extended period of time, just like if you were to, obviously, people that are malnourished and are in a famine all the time, like, then there could be illnesses that arise from being malnourished, right? Your body needs to function on vitamins and minerals and nutrients to thrive. And so I'll be quiet and listen to some more questions.
Sure. We're going to actually cross over to a different kind of question. This is asked by Varun, and he wants to know, can you please address the crossover with keto diet, as more publicly known as a high-fat diet? So essentially, I think he wants to know the crossover of fasting along with the keto diet.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't recommend a ketogenic diet. And a ketogenic diet is a high-fat diet where you're consuming more than 70% of your macronutrient profile of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, where the carbohydrates, I believe, are below 30 grams a day, and you have at least 70% fat, and your body is not getting enough glucose in calorically, and so you've then depleted the glycogen stores, which is your glucose, complex carbohydrate that your body stores in your muscles and your glycogen. And so after a few days of eating that way, your body says, well, I'm not getting any glucose because you won't eat a purple potato. So I'm going to shift my metabolism to ketones. I'm going to use this fat that he's eating, to make ketones as my fuel. And that is the process of going into ketosis. When you're fasting, okay, so that is like this state that you're inducing intentionally as a day-to-day living. And then you're like, okay, what happens when you're starving? What does your body do to save itself? It goes into ketosis. It says he's not eating any glucose. He's not eating any fat. He's not eating any protein. What do? Well, let me burn his muscles and turn that into some glucose, right? And because, or else the machine will die, the human body. And let's use his fat, and fat burns off as ketones. And so in the fasting, I don't know. So fasting is fasting triggers a metabolic pathway of metabolism for energy called ketosis. You could hack the system and eat lots of fat and very little protein and very little carbohydrate, and start triggering this emergency pathway, metabolic pathway that occurs called ketosis. So that's what's happening. That's why David Perlmutter, who used to be an advocate of ketosis, is like, you know what? That isn't the right way. That, if I'm going to be a medical doctor making recommendations off of what the best available evidence is to promote health and wellness and longevity.
And to be in a state of ketosis, could you explain to us why is that dangerous? To be in a sustained period of ketosis, people who are on a ketogenic diet and and practicing fasting.
Well, as opposed to necessarily stating that it's dangerous, I mean, there is a lot of literature that does point towards causing complications of osteoporosis and kidney failure. But when being used for a very, very small percentage of a tragic afflicted population of children that are suffering from recalcitrant seizures, meaning that they won't respond to medical interventions, if they place them on a ketogenic diet, it could help change the metabolism of the brain and seems to help these children with this horrible seizure disorder that won't really respond to medications. They place them in a ketogenic diet. And then they have all this body of literature that shows that children on these ketogenic diets do suffer from a lot of complications and do struggle with this lifestyle, and it can be dialed in and there can be a certain quality of life, and there are pretty savvy ways that nutritionists and chefs have made it a relatively palatable lifestyle that is a medical area that I haven't had clinical experience with in regards to managing children in that regards. And it's more so, as opposed to saying, well, ketogenic diets are bad, it's more so there's all this literature and evidence that shows that a whole food plant-based diet is healthy for you and can prevent, suspend, and reverse these chronic diseases. And a ketogenic diet doesn't have that type of body of evidence. And it's also, doesn't have some of the positive side effects of adhering to a plant-based lifestyle, like less of a carbon footprint on the environment, or less of a indirect voting of our lifestyles towards a proclivity to you know, mass manufacturing animals and destroying land to raise crops to feed those animals to then feed to ourselves that can make us very sick. So it's just not a very sufficient long-term plan. It's more so, you know, seeking what is expedient and pleasurable at the cost down the road. So so the ketogenic diet, perhaps, you know, there is a, you know, oftentimes there, you know, there could be there is a body of scientists out there that don't adhere to the idea that saturated fat leads to cardiovascular disease or chronic diseases. There is a lot of literature supporting that, and a ketogenic diet has there are some plant-based ketogenic diets that do occur, that do exist, but for the most part, a ketogenic diet on the lower end of the spectrum of quality is typically very high in saturated fat, and saturated fat does increase our insulin resistance. It does is correlated with dementia, with diabetes, with heart disease, with cancer. So in that regards, ketogenic diet could sometimes get thrown out with the bathwater, I guess. You know, there are perhaps some healthier ways in some individualized situations where people do really well on a ketogenic diet. But to recommend that to the masses and market it the way that it's been done, I think is not, like, you know, is not optimal, I guess, you know, or leading to the greatest good.
Right. Yeah. So there are at least 4 different questions that we have, and with, you know, 7 minutes to 2 p.m. To the hour, let me actually breeze through a couple of them. So there's one question about, you know, he says, Babar says he's a big advocate of intermittent fasting. However, he's noticed a spike in his sugar cravings whenever he fasts, especially during the period of Ramadan. And is there any correlation between fasting and sugar cravings?
Yeah, it's called the dietary pleasure trap, and you're addicted to sugar. To get off of you're like, I want to quit cigarettes, and when I try not to smoke the cigarettes, the end of the day, I really want the cigarettes. You know, you're addicted to it, and it's not your fault. And sometimes fasting and then breaking your fast without the sugars makes a difference. And it sometimes takes more than just a day. And sometimes it's creating the environment and conditions to not have it readily accessible to you. And sometimes that's really hard. And sometimes that's a matter of like being like surrendering and saying, hey, if there are kids in the house, honey, like that's the locked, you know, area that I don't have access to, you know, and because I don't have self-control, you know, because that is my survival mechanism. It's like blaming yourself for wanting air. Like, oh, I want to breathe. Well, it's just your survival mechanism, and people have a different tendency towards it. Some people have one drink of alcohol and they're alcoholics, and some people never want to drink. There's a different spectrum where our minds are set up. And
right. There's one that pertains to the coronavirus situation that we're going through, and Annalisa wants to know, is it a good idea to fast under the coronavirus threat and weaken our immune system?
I think that it's certainly another thing to consider medically for the individual. You know, what is their exposure risk, right? Are you well isolated, or are you do you have medical issues and you also have a husband or wife that's going to the hospital and then coming home? You know, maybe it's not the best idea to be partaking in a fast that stresses your system in that regards. You know, where you might be a little weakened. You might respond to the fast different than the healthier individual that might thrive and do really well, it stresses you so much that it kind of creates immune senescence where your immune system doesn't work as well. And you are a little bit more exposed to something that we don't know a lot about. So err on the side of caution. And if you are isolated and your risk is low that's something that I could do a consultation for in that regards.
Mm-hmm.
Telemedicine consult.
Dr. Queller, quick question. I'm a mentor to a young adult, 23 years old, very smart woman. She'll be the first one to say, I am a highly processed child and I want to get away. She's so smart, she knows her palate has been hacked with sugar and fats. And every time I give her something, her palate goes, oof. And I know from stories at True North, when people go in and they have given food at the beginning and then they fast for a few days. I know there's one story where somebody went in and said, oh, this food is horrible. And then he fasted.
It's
and
like
then
swell.
days later, he says, now this is food, not what you gave me when I first got here. It was the same food, right? So should I consider doing like a little fast with this young adult to see if maybe after fasting, I could present other recipes to her and see how it works? What do you think?
It sometimes could be considered, or sometimes that's sometimes the experience of what happens with a juice fast, or that Penn Jillette's Presto, like he went on a potato fast, and right, like so it's like if you take away the hyper palatable processed food that's creating that dopaminergic drug-like effect hit, whether it's just consuming water or whether it's just, having green smoothies, or whether it's, whatever it might be, or really eating 100% unprocessed whole fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, like, you will get over this dietary pleasure trap.
Okay.
Fasting is a tool, and sometimes, I think that it's just appropriate to just have some medical discretion or someone to weigh in on what the individualized goals are and what medical things need to be considered and how long they're doing the fast, and whether it's a fasting mimicking diet or just water or with soup broth or with just juices, or so it just depends, but it can be a tool to help reset the palate, most definitely.
Okay, so we've got 2 more minutes left. Nivi, real quick, since you're doing a great job at reading there.
All right. Oh, okay. So there's one question. I think I might have actually missed it. So Michael wants to know, you mentioned the body is able to clean up the cellular debris. How does the body perform phase 2 of detoxification, where the bad is conjugated out with only water? My intuition tells me water alone without the nutrients to conjugate can be harmful in the medium to long term. Yes, no, maybe.
Well, I guess on the last question, I don't have the answer to that. It sounds like that's like a if I was a professor in medical school, I should know the answer to. It sounds like, that's someone who's reading the textbooks about, the details of, the metabolic processes of fasting. It's a great question. I don't necessarily have like the textbook answer for that. And I think that fasting for some can be stopped. People will go in for a medically supervised water-only fast, and they'll be monitoring their labs. And sometimes there are certain situations where it needs to be stopped. And perhaps what the gentleman or gal was asking, leads to a certain stress on the organ systems and could be detected on labs. But I don't know like how you would measure that. Same thing with autophagy. We can measure blood pressure, we can measure glucose, we could take your blood and under a microscope count the stem cells that maybe are produced. There isn't a test for autophagy. So these are things that were studied under labs, or people won Nobel laureates, won their, gold medals for, and but I don't know the answer to that. I think of like phase 2 like phase 1 being you've depleted your glycogen, phase 2, the cellular cleanup, phase 3, stem cell production, and like 5 days is kind of, day 4 or 5 days is kind of that sweet spot. It's definitely by day 3, you're full into like triggering this fasting state and like being in ketosis and turning on the autophagy, and day 4 and 5, after that, you're really going to potentially increase the risk of complications. And I would say the main one is getting lightheaded and passing out.
Yeah.
That'd be a main one.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, very well articulated, Dr. Queller. Thank you so much. So Nina has a question around how do any recommendations for preparing or breaking the fast, and with however I've done it, I believe safely, gently. Breaking it is critical, and typically what I would do is a green juice and fruits on the day when I'm breaking the fast. Any other additional quick recommendations, Dr. Queller?
Yeah, I think categorically it would be like high water foods. So like melon, like zucchini, like something that's easy to digest, like a green juice, right? With green juices, you want to be careful with things like spinach or beet greens or Swiss chard. Those are high in oxalates. Same thing if like you're putting them in smoothies and consuming an abnormally large quantity than you would otherwise be able to when you chew. That could perhaps be, a counterproductive thing for the individual. But it's just, go low, go slow, go light, nutrient-rich, calorically low food. So it's like the berries, the fruits. It depends on how long you've been fasting, but like sometimes just some steel cut oats or just a smoothie or a banana or an apple, some steamed veggies, like squash, as opposed to like maybe broccoli that might be too fibrous and, cause too much gas.
All right.
We get to end now. Thank you, Dr. Queller and Nivi Jaswal. And I just want to remind everyone about our ongoing web series and invite you to some of our future events. And you could see them on our website, Plant Powered Metro New York. And you can also join us on Facebook, Instagram, and Meetup. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Doctor.